All right, I think we've got hopefully our initial complement of audience members here with us. So thanks again for everyone for joining us, both here at the FOSI 2020 annual conference, Building Resilience, but also here at our panel. This panel is titled Online Activism, Social Justice Meets Social Media. And we have a wonderful lineup today of folks. Just a few housekeeping. Please feel free to plop questions for the panelists into the session chat, and we will be delighted to answer them, most likely towards the end of our conversation. Yeah, we're looking forward to having the audience participate in this conversation today. Otherwise, I'm going to start introducing all of our panelists just by name, and then I'm going to ask them to give a 1 to 2 minute introduction of themselves, and then we'll dig in on some questions about online activism on social media. So again, thanks for joining us, and I'm going to kick it off. I'll introduce myself. Hi everyone, I'm Amanda Lenhart. I'm the Program Director for Health and Data at the Data and Society Research Institute and a longtime friend of FOSI. Really glad to be here as a moderator today. Mostly, I think my job here is to drop in some questions and get out of the way, because we have a really stellar panel of activists and platform folks here to help us understand what it's like from all different sides of these issues. So thanks again for joining us. I will kick it over first to Alexandria, and then we'll work down the line as I see everybody's faces on my screen. So Alexandria, please introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, great to be here today. So first of all, my name is Alexandria Villaseñor. I'm a 19-year-old climate activist and the founder of the Uprising International. And so I got involved in the climate movement where I started striking every Friday in New York City and solidarity with my Friday movement. And I started that on December 14th, and I strike every Friday all the way up until so that's over a year. And so, of course, after I started striking and organizing the global climate crisis all throughout 2019, I realized just how important climate education was to get young people into this movement. And so that's when I ended up launching the Uprising and educate young people peer-to-peer on the climate crisis. And so I'm very excited to be here with all of you today, because social media plays a huge role in the movement as well. And so it's great to be talking about it.
Great. Up next, Reggie. Thanks. Please introduce yourself.
Sure. I wasn't sure where I was on your screen, but I guess I'll go ahead and jump in. I'm Reggie McCrimmon. I have the privilege and honor of working at Twitter on our public policy team, also covering not just issues related to working with elected officials and civil society, but also some of our philanthropic work, some of our Twitter for Good and nonprofit work as well. And so many of my colleagues are probably on watching and representing them. So grateful for this opportunity. I would say this week marks, I got a notice that this week marks 11 years for me on Twitter, actually using the service. I've only been at the company for a year now, but 11 years using the service. And I bring that up because I love the product, and that's what brought me here. I really felt that the product and actually being on Twitter and what Twitter has an opportunity to create is one that is second to none, and it's one that I really had an awesome time working with from my time in Congress, and then also some of my time working with nonprofits and other tech companies, really using the service to reach people. What we like to say, particularly at Twitter and on our public policy team, is that Twitter isn't just a service or a platform that's look at me and look at what I'm doing, but it's a service that we say is look at us. And it's I think what makes Twitter home to a lot of the movements and a lot of the activists who do the great work of shining light on issues that aren't always seen in mainstream. And so, with everything going on over the summer with the uncertainty of this pandemic, and also some of the social justice causes and things that have happened over the summer, I think this panel is very, very important. And I really look forward to not just offering and sharing what I think Twitter is doing uniquely, but also listening to some of the great young activists on this call. I can't say too young, we're probably around the same around the same age, but I really look forward to listening and hearing how many of the leaders on this call, on this conference, and those who are participating are using Twitter, right? As it is definitely a tool of the 21st century leader. And so I'm really excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me, and look forward to learning from all of us.
Great. Thanks so much, Reggie. That was terrific. Next up is Julia, and then we'll go to Jerome.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm super inspired by everyone here today. My name is Julia Morgan-Canales. I'm a Mexican-American 16-year-old student from New York City. I'm an aspiring activist and journalist. I say aspiring because I'm really just getting into the world of activism and writing, and I'm super excited to work more. I had the amazing opportunity of working with Techonomy this summer, a media company, and throughout this year writing articles about pressing issues in the current climate, and specifically about like technology and how to use technology and in turn social media platforms to help better our world.
Great. Thank you, Julia. That's terrific. And Jerome.
Hi, my name is Jerome Foster II. I'm 18 years old. I'm the founder and executive director of 1Million which is an international youth advocacy organization really uniting young people around the key issues like climate justice, immigration reform, gender equality, racial equity, and gun violence prevention. And I started my work as a climate activist, just like Alexandria, with climate striking, her in New York City and myself at the White House. And we organized, and for me, it was just like, how do we expand this? How do we continue our work? How do we transfer this energy that has been in the streets, organizing protests, to really change the political sphere and have young people rise to the political occasion? Because millions of young people turned 18 this year. So we want to activate them, educate young people, and just make sure that they know the resources to get out and vote. And that's the work that I've been doing. I started 1Million as an intern for Congressman John Lewis. And really through that work, that as an interning in Congress, I just understood the vast majority of how change happens, and understanding how we can activate young people to call a member of Congress and like write letters into congressional members' offices to really let them understand that young people are engaged in politics and that we are willing to take action. And yeah, that's kind of the work that we do. And we're happy to continue working and organizing young people around the world.
Great. Thank you so much, Jerome. Like I said, absolutely all-star panel here. So let's dig in. And my first question, which is really for everyone on the panel, and I can call on folks so that it's a little bit easier to organize our speaking, but I'd love to hear from you about what you see as the most exciting innovations or changes that you've seen maybe over the last year. It could be pandemic related, it could be just technologically related, or new uses that you're seeing of different platforms for activism. So yeah, I would just love to hear about some of the things that you're seeing on the ground that are really exciting to you. So maybe why don't we start with Jerome?
Yeah, absolutely. So throughout this pandemic, it has been a huge shift in the environmental movement, and like most movements, because we've had the space to actually sit down and have conversations with one another. Because a lot of times when we're on like different like organizing and like marches, we aren't able to actually have nuanced conversations about policy and things. But on Zoom, we can be on here for 2 hours and have a conversation about the Clean Energy DC Act, or talk about the Climate Change Education Act, and really understand and break it down. And I think that's really what has been a huge shift as we move to online, is that it's allowed us to have a lot better conversations that go into the details. Another thing that we've seen that OneMillionOfUs has done in the lead up to election, we created the first ever virtual reality civic event focused on young people called Prom at the Polls, where young people like dressed up in their prom outfits, they went into a virtuality space, and you could like take a picture of yourself in like a suit or a prom dress, and you went in there and just had a celebration of being an adult and going out and being civically active for the first time. And we live streamed that to Twitter Periscope, and like people like tuned in all across the world, just watching young people be excited and take pictures. And that was one of the big innovations that we've seen, is virtual reality now having a comeback. Because before I was an activist, I was a virtual reality developer, and it's been my pride and joy of like, if I was an activist, I would be like a coder. So it was like getting back to my roots and like building a virtuality space for young people to have like social VR and social interactions and get outside the dorm room or wherever they are and go into like a virtual space where they're able to hang out with their friends and such. And that's some of the innovations I've seen.
Great. Julia, how about you? Innovations you've seen in the space?
I think what's been really interesting is this summer, especially during the pandemic, there was like a huge rise of like people on TikTok. And of course, that started like young people making political movements on TikTok. And I think TikTok is a platform that adults don't really understand, don't really go on that much, which makes it really unique for the teenage perspective. And I'm just remembering when teens on TikTok like signed up for one of Trump's rallies, and they kind of like pranked his rally. And I remember thinking I joined in on that, of course. And I remember thinking that was like really innovative and like using this platform made for like dancing videos to kind of make our opinions known. Like, we can't vote, but we're going to show this president what we think. And I thought that was just like kind of an example of like the creativity that can come with social media.
Great. Reggie, what are you seeing on the Twitter side in terms of innovations in use? And maybe it's not just on Twitter, other platforms you're aware of, but what are you seeing in terms of new uses of the platform for activism?
Yeah, I think we saw a huge, great innovation across the industry around elections. I think, with everything that we were facing and all that we learned from 2016, I think some of the product enhancements that we've seen across all platforms, encouraging people to register to vote, making it easy for them to do so, right on the service or on the platform, allowing people to share pictures about what's happening at their polling place so that they can better inform those election officials who were interested in making sure that we had a safe and secure election. So I think we saw a lot of innovation across all industries on how to get more people engaged and to get more people active. I think one of my favorite pieces, because I work at Twitter, but also because I love Twitter more, is I think giving users control is something that we prioritize at Twitter. And it's something that I talk to a lot of activists and particularly elected officials when, they ask personally, hey, how can I better manage everything that's coming in on the service? How can I actually see messages from my constituents, or actually see tweets from my staff, or maybe just see tweets from people who I really want to follow and make sure that I'm looking. So creating more lists, right, is one thing that I encourage people to do, especially activists, those who know that people are following them and they're showing up to their rallies, creating a list where you can see people who are actively engaging around this. And so you can see the tweets that they're having, and you kind of create a community there, but also giving folks access on how to manage the conversation. And you can use the mute feature and the block feature. I'm an advocate for those, because I think, all of us being able to receive information, but also create ways of which we can stay healthy and create safer mental health for ourselves. Like sometimes you want to mute a conversation and you want to make sure that you're hearing the right stuff. And so the mute feature is important as well. I'll also say you can hide replies. That's one thing as well. And then I'll also point out that this week we rolled out fleets on Twitter, which some think are like stories on Instagram, but we rolled out fleets. And so now you can share content. And I know that's particularly popular among us younger generation. We can tweet something and you can fleet it and it actually go away in 24 hours. And so maybe mom and dad might not be able to catch up with you in time to see everything that happened. But that allows for you to tweet things that are happening right now, or to share content with your friends of maybe, things that are happening in that current moment. And so I think there are a lot of innovations that are happening right now that are giving people more control and more ways of sharing with people in their community and people who care about the issues that they care about, but also still allowing them to reach those who want to follow as well. And the last thing I'll point out, I think also not just that, but having choice on how to view your timeline. I say this for activists often. There's a little icon at the top of your Twitter feed. It looks like a little sparkle where you can actually change from looking at your timeline from just the top tweets and what is coming up to the top, but actually looking at it in a reverse chronological order. So if you're at an event and you're following a particular hashtag, you can see what's actually happening in that time instead of what might be getting the most engagement. And so giving people choice and giving users choice is something that we have been trying to do a lot more of. And those are a couple of features that are my favorite.
That's Perfect. Thank you, Reggie. Alexandria, any innovations that you've been seeing that you want to share?
There's a couple that come to mind, and I kind of want to first echo Julia's comments. I think that TikTok is being used more and more for viral activism for Gen Z. I also participated in the Trump Tulsa rally organizing, and we managed to scoop up over 1 million tickets to that rally because of TikTok. And so I also wanted to add that we are also organizing on TikTok when it comes to electing politicians. For example, we organized for Ed Markey's re-election and his campaign, and we created a network of social media accounts across platforms that we called the Markeyverse. And so I had the honor of being on a panel with Senator Markey after the election, actually, and he created this online community with taking the lead in he credited this Gen Z youth activism and everything to really being the reason why he got his reelection, especially during the pandemic. And so I think as well, also as a climate activist, we've organized across many different platforms this past year. And so I think probably the largest campaign we've done, and it's actually still going, is the Fridays for Future Digital Strike campaign. And so we had to move a lot of our activism online after the pandemic. And so basically every Friday, youth would strike digitally, and our purpose during the pandemic would be to flood social media every single Friday with posts about the climate crisis, and then tag our leaders and demand action through that. And so in these posts, we're also highlighting the effects of the climate crisis, and so which youth are experiencing right now. Because so many people are staying in their homes right now, it's easier to not see what's happening to our planet. And so that's why we use social media to remind them.
That's great. That's great. And actually, that's a good segue to a next question, which is about sort of taking online activism into the real world. And how does it translate for you? And, for a young activist on the panel, what are the ways? I mean, I think, Alexandria, you just gave a nice example about, the Markeyverse translating into actual, being a useful community for Ed Markey. What other kinds of movement from the, I don't want to say digital space to meat space, because I think sometimes it's an artificial designation, but what are the differences? How are you seeing things translate? And again, where's the pandemic getting in the way of that? And why don't we start with Julia this time?
This is a very basic example, but I think a really powerful example is the Black Lives Matter protests that we've seen across the country, across the world. And I think this might be some people might think that this is silly or discredit it, but on Twitter, actually, I remember BTS, a K-pop group, donated $1 million, and all of their followers decided they made a hashtag match a million. And these followers made and found and donated $1 million to Black Lives Matter movement. And I think that's really powerful. A hashtag created real change and real funding and real money to help a really important movement. And it's really easy to be K-pop stands, but no, these are people who care about the world around us, who care about injustice, and who are really doing things and finding money that politicians aren't giving and creating change. And I think that's one example of a virtual space having really positive real world change.
Yeah, I think that echoing the words of Julio, there has been massive organizing around the Black Lives Matter movement, and also around elections and turning Black organizing into Black votes, and really getting that sentiment transformed to the ballot box. And one thing that we've seen is that the Black Women's March was organizing an event in New York City, and we're also in Philadelphia, we're organizing a march bus to the polls, Black and people from West Philadelphia to more populated East Philadelphia that has more polling locations. And through digital organizing, we were able to coordinate both of the campaigns to have an entire concert that spanned both cities. And we have people tune out and listen to the song, listen to the concert. And we have people marching to the polls in Philadelphia and New York City, dropping people off at their polling location. And that was a coordinated effort that wouldn't have happened if we didn't have the digital and physical working in tandem, live at the event, because if something happened in Philadelphia, that would impact what we're doing in New York City and vice versa. And that kind of changed how we organized, because also we had to make sure that we're socially distanced. So a lot of it was how do we coordinate to make sure that we don't go too close to polling location, or that we are following the guidelines of social distancing. And it's been like really great because we've seen people that aren't even in America join as well, like people that are just supporting the elections in the US and supporting the work that's happening of young people turning out to vote. What happened all through people just seeing our trends all over the world, because it's not contained to the US. It's contained to just our generation just being happy for each other, seeing each other like rise to the political occasion. Like in the UK, they had like the Youth Quake, and a lot of US teens were like showing support for a lot of young people that were in the UK that were turning out to vote. And then the same thing was happening in November 3rd. And people all over the world were just supporting young people. And it was great to see. Like, it's always amazing to see like our generation uniting internationally, because a lot of people discredit us. They say that young people are just texting, they're not really doing anything impactful, but we have so much power because we're more united than anybody else. Like, we're able to use our voice in many different ways. We're able to use it physically with marching, use it digitally with tweeting and posting Instagram and literally everything. We have like so many outlets to voice our opinions, and I think that's been the great way that we've seen the pandemic really bolster our impact on many different platforms.
Great. So Alexandria, and then we'll go to Reggie if you have thoughts too.
I think that, for all of these social movements, from climate and Black Lives Matter, social media is definitely one of the most important ways that we translate activism into the real world. And so it's how we meet each other across countries and continents, like Jerome was saying. And when we can't travel to see one another, then we use it to organize and get people out into the streets. And so we post our events on social media. So many people have the information and know where to go when there's a protest or an action happening. But the other thing I wanted to bring up is that during our events, we use social media to report on it and live stream our activism. And so this has been really important, especially during this year, because protests and direct actions will change so fast. And so the ability to see what's happening in real time has become so much more important in activism.
Great.
I would just add, I think just to add on everyone's points, you can't talk about social justice nowadays without talking about social media, right? If we look at the title of this panel, Social Justice Meets Social Media, I think, social justice is a huge part of social media, right? If we look at, and everyone brought up kind of Black Lives Matter and what has happened over the summer. If we look at the period of time at the height of Black Lives Matter over this summer, and we look at it particularly from May 25th to June 10th, we saw that there were nearly 206 tweets per second about Black Lives Matter. That was 17% of all conversation globally about Black Lives Matter on Twitter, right? That was 17% of all conversation there. That's upwards of 320 million tweets in all. And so you're looking at a movement that became more than just a moment, right? And it did so on Twitter. And this has led to, which was probably the most comprehensive, reported as the most comprehensive community policing bill passed through the House of Representatives ever, right? And we still have a ways to go, but this was all done during the height of a pandemic where most people were staying at home, and it was done. And that pressure was created because of activists and those raising their voice, saying that something needed to be done. And so I think what we're seeing here is absolutely right. Like, there are real world implications and things that happen because of things that often start on platforms, particularly on Twitter. And so, yeah, I just want to highlight that. I think there's a lot of work to do on this, but we're seeing that having a voice on the service and creating that pressure, allowing people to have those honest conversations and respond back and forth with each other and also organize, is leading to real progress on issues that we haven't seen progress in for a long time in the U.S.
Thanks for that. And, I want to sort of actually come back to you, Reggie, with another question. And actually, it will tie into questions for our activists on the panel. For you, Reggie, I think as a platform, Twitter, it's obviously doing a wonderful job in supporting activism. And we have wonderful activists on this panel, but there's also people who use the platform for things that are not so great, right? They call it activism, but it may be inciting violence. Yeah. It may be inciting other kinds of more negative things that we maybe broadly don't want to see in the world as a society. How do you at Twitter like sort through this information, and what do we need to know? What is Twitter's approach to managing some of the sort of good versus bad actors in these spaces?
Yeah, sure. No, very good question. And, just to be absolutely clear that, hateful conduct or incitement of violence and glorification of violence have no place on our service. And that is something that we are serious about. And we recognize that there are those who, and plenty of our users who are experiencing this. And in order for us to, serve the public conversation and to earn trust, we have to do better on these particular areas where we're seeing hate and abuse and incitement of violence. And so we're getting a lot better at being able to detect most of this content, and we want to be able to detect it before users actually have to report it, right? We want to make sure that it's not on the burden of many of us who use the service for good to have to report things that are happening bad. We can spend more time, promoting and being activists for the good that we're trying to see in the world. And so we're doing a better job of making sure that we are surfacing this content proactively so that others don't have to take risks there. This is done a lot through technology, right? And training our technology to pick up on a lot of this, which is difficult to do, right? Because there's a lot of context that has to go into some of the nuances of language and different terms that we all might use differently. And so we're really working through that. A lot of that also is working with many of our partners. We work closely with civil rights and civil society partners who actually have proximity to the people and to the issues that we care so deeply about, right? And particularly as it relates to underserved, underrepresented groups. And so having those partnerships, surfacing this content so others don't have to do so using technology, but working with our partners to better understand this so that we can inform many of those who enforce these policies for us are really important as well. And then also promoting and supporting authoritative voices who can push back and provide reliable information. You saw that a lot with how we handled elections, but also how we handled COVID. If you went into the service, we really prioritize making sure that those who are scientists and doctors and health officials, that we promoted that content, that we made sure that content was easily accessible, and we put it all in a hub for people to find. Same thing with elections. So, we have to continue to do a lot more in this work, and working with activists and elected officials and others of society will really help us get better at this.
That's great. And, sort of a question that I think attaches onto that for Alexandria, Jerome, and Julia is, in this space of social justice and activism, there is misinformation and disinformation. And by misinformation, I mean people sharing information that's inaccurate, kind of without thinking and without malice. And by disinformation, I mean sharing information specifically to mislead, sharing incorrect information to mislead people. In your own work, how do you manage misinformation and disinformation? How do you talk about it with your followers and your colleagues? And how do you figure out what information that you can trust online? So how do you manage this? I think we're going to start with Alexandria, and then we'll go to Jerome and Julia.
It's very important because, of course, on social media there can be quite a bit of misinformation, and I see it all the time in places like infographics. Sometimes you have to be like, is this infographic satire? Is it real or is it misinformation? But as a movement, we have thousands of different social media accounts because local chapters of our organizations always establish their own social media accounts. So through this network, we can create coordinated information, campaigns, like a troll farm, but only real with factual information. So the good part about having so many activists with personal accounts as well and with organization accounts is that we can also use them to counter this misinformation. And so we've had to do this a lot before. And however, it's hard on places like Twitter also because we build our platforms and then we get hacked, or people try and get our accounts shut down or banned. And so having access to verification for really large accounts at least would definitely be very helpful and important. And I think that also in the climate movement, we've had to do a lot of fact checking, and that's actually part of the education we give young people. And so I know in my organization, Earth Uprising, we teach young people how to discern facts from misinformation. And so unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation in climate change, and it's really well funded as well. For example, Exxon and Shell financed decades-long misinformation campaigns, and actually Exxon spent $30 million in climate denial. So our fact-checking game has to be on point because we're up against some very big climate deniers.
Great. Jerome?
Yeah, absolutely. Echoing all the words of Alexandria, it's incredibly important for us being a youth-led organization that's talking about voting and providing voter education. A lot of our work was making sure that we don't share any information that's not real. We have to go the extra mile of making it easy, making it accessible, and also dispelling other myths like voting by text. That was a huge thing. A lot of young people thought they could just vote by text. And I was like, no, you have to go to vote.org, go through that process. And we had to make like YouTube video explainers and go the extra mile of doing that. And definitely exactly what Alexandria is saying, like with the facts, you have to go back and make sure all the facts per state are correct too, because in the US there's like a lot of different state by state nuances that you have to go through. And you have to make sure you're correct on what's happening in Georgia is also happening in Pennsylvania and Nevada and California. And that's like a lot of the work that we did as well, is like trying to make sure that people that aren't in New York aren't abiding by New York laws, thinking that they can register to vote on election day when really they have to register to vote 2 weeks prior to that. And yeah, like it's kind of crazy, like seeing a lot of what was happening this election season, from like trying to stay nonpartisan and just trying to talk about the issues. It was pretty hard, but it was worth it in the end, because we saw a lot of young people on social media talking about like the fact that they found out about OneMillionOfUs and were like bringing their friends, and we wound up getting like 1.8 million like views on and interactions on social media, from TikTok to Twitter and Instagram, and getting young people engaged and reached our goal of really meeting the moment. So that was pretty great for us. Pretty challenging, but it was also like us staying up at 2 a.m. every night, struggling to figure out what we should post in like rapid response.
Yeah, it's hard. It requires a lot of resources, and whether that's your own time or a group of Alexandria's network. Julia, what about you?
Yeah, I think one issue with social media and misinformation is kind of accountability. I know a lot of kids who just see something, they put it on their story, they share it around, because you often don't feel that accountability of putting your name on something, of adding like petitions. I know a lot of people signed petitions that weren't true petitions, that weren't actually doing anything. And it was really easy to just put your name on something, not even realize. So I think an important thing about thinking about misinformation is accidental misinformation, which I think is really common. It's not always with malicious intent. It's just not researching something and taking it as true. And I think a really big problem with a lot of social justice movements is I often try to research things that I find online, and I have to ask myself, am I not finding this because it's fake, or am I not finding this because it's something that people don't talk about? And I think that's really hard to know, because often I know a lot of other activists, like we're trying to spread the things that people aren't talking about. So is there no proof because no one's talking about it, or is it fake? And I think it's just like really hard to research these things, and you have to put in the time. You can't just add your name onto things and share things without really thinking about it.
Absolutely. So another question I have, it's for all of you, it's for everyone. So for our activists, what do parents get wrong about how young people use social media and activism? What are they getting wrong, and what do you want them to know? And for Reggie, what do activists need to know about what it's like being Twitter in this time? Like, what do you want activists to know? What do they get wrong about what it's like, what's going on with Twitter, and what do you want them to know? So why don't we start with you, Jerome, and we'll go to Alexandria, then Julia, and then Reggie.
Yeah, I'm going to be completely honest. Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries. The question is what do adults get wrong? What do they get about young people using social media for activism, and what do you want them to know? What do you want to correct in the record?
Absolutely. I think that a lot of adults just underestimate us. They think that us swiping on Twitter and just like going through and like scrolling is not making an impact. And really it's like we're working with our community, and it's like talking with your friends or going out and creating like a march, like, because every time you tweet like from an activist, like I normally get like 2,000 views per thing. It's like, that's like a small march right there. Just like any activist that's really well, like you're creating a movement right there every single time you tweet. So it's like, that's like the most impactful thing we can do. Sometimes it's just posting on social media. So I think that adults just underestimate our skill and underestimate the work that we're doing. Also, I think that a lot of them don't know. They expect us to like read newspapers and like watch TV for information, and they don't understand that we consume information at a faster rate. So we can scroll past 5 tweets and understand like, oh, this is what the election day is, this is where I need to go, this is what the location is, this is where we need to like organize to get there. And like we learn that a lot quicker than watching like an 8-minute TV ad that's on there that we can't skip. So it's like it's a lot easier for us to organize that way. And I think they also try to negate us by like, what are we going to do in the future? Like, are we going to continue organizing on social media? And it's like, it's only going to get bigger. Like, we aren't going to all of a sudden not post on Instagram anymore. It's not like we're going to just all of a sudden just become adults and just start using fax numbers and stuff like that. It's like, we're going to continue like doing this. And I think they see it as like a temporary fad and not as like, this is the new norm for what we're going to do. So I think that's some of the things.
Great. Thanks. Jerome.
Yeah, I love that. I think that generationally, social media is used so differently. Like a lot of Gen X and older is on Facebook, and we hardly use Facebook at all. And Gen Z is mostly on Instagram, and then Twitter is more of a platform for professional academics and for news. I feel like I've met so many climate scientists on Twitter as well. And so what's really interesting is how someone can be Twitter famous but unknown on Instagram, or vice versa. So I guess what I want older generations to know is that every platform is used so differently, and it's important in its own way. So it's important to use all of them. And so often adults think all social media is the same, so they'll discount platforms that they either don't use or don't like. And I think that finally to know that using social media is work, and it's not all fun, and it's not socializing, although it can be, but social media is now a platform to get work done.
Great.
Yeah, I think adding on to that, and with Jerome.
Julia?
Oh, sorry, yeah. I think hearing Jerome say that we consume information, I think that's really accurate. Almost every morning I go downstairs and my parents are like, oh, did you see that this happened? And I'm like, yeah. I saw that in the first 2 minutes of opening my phone, and it's my first story on Instagram. And I think it is news, but I think social media, and what adults really don't understand, is that on social media, there aren't journalists or reporters. Everyone can give information. Everyone can share their opinions. And I remember when I wrote one of my first pieces, my parents were so excited. And then I remember being like, wait, I wrote a borderline essay on one of my Instagram posts. Why aren't you excited about that? And they were like, well, that's not as real. And I'm like, okay, but 3 times the amount of people saw it on Instagram versus on this media outlet. So I think you really just can't deny the power that social media has, and the work that people are putting into social media and into their captions and into their stories and into their Twitter posts. It's real work. And I think you just have to start acknowledging that and researching.
Great. Reggie?
Yeah, I wish I had that question. You gave me the more difficult question of activists. I wouldn't dare do that. I will.
Not criticizing that? No, actually not criticizing, but helping them. What do they need to know to be more effective?
No, yeah, and all the same, I think to be more effective is continue to do exactly what you're doing, right? I think people on Twitter shape what's happening, right? We are here to serve the public conversation, and many of you drive the conversation, and you also shape culture, right? And so you have a real world impact on what happens on and off our platform. And I think that is really, really important to continue to remember. And then also, we always prioritize, and our top priority is health, right? The health of the conversation is our top priority. And we know that, as we continue our work, people want to find credible information, and they also want to feel safe participating in the conversation, which is why we prioritize, the health of the conversation. We recognize that the less healthy the conversation is around things or events that are happening, the less likely people will want to actually be on or utilize our service. And so that is a top priority. And so, it's encouraging to hear, a lot of the words that you all are saying, because it really kind of makes concrete some of the conversations we're having internally about the work that we need to do to continue to support many activists and everyone that uses our service. And so, with that, one thing that I would say that I hear with activists, or if I get a text from an activist or an escalation from someone else inside of Twitter, it's typically because, as tensions rise and as conversations now become a lot more complex, and often you'll see the conversation around many of the activists also do the same. And so we enforce our rules across the board, no matter who you are, right? Like, our rules are there. And so oftentimes activists might tweet out something with good intentions in supporting a cause. It might include the private information of someone, or trying to disclose a location where a rally is happening, but it actually is disclosing private information, which might go against our terms, that we would have to take action there. But being able to work with our enforcement teams to give context and explain what happens, we often have to do that. But I just want to reiterate that I think oftentimes in the heat of the moment, we can tweet things to respond to people and let them know how we feel. But we also want to make sure that you're able to continue expressing your opinion, but doing so in a healthy way. And so I think that's the main thing. We want to continue to make sure that health, can maintain it, will continue to be our top priority. And we want to make sure everybody's able to use the service to speak to the issues that they want to speak to.
That's super helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Reggie. I just want to, I have a few more questions. We're also coming towards the end of the panel, and I just want to encourage anyone in the audience. I'm starting to see a few questions come up in the chat, but if there are questions that you'd like to ask the panelists, please do let me know, and we'll hopefully be able to squeeze them in at the end. So my question for everyone, it sort of builds off of what Reggie is just talking about, which is a little bit about what advice would you give to young activists about using social media to amplify their message, but also how to do it in a way that keeps them safe and keeps their followers safe. And we can start, you just nodded, Jerome, so I'm going to start with you.
Okay. Yeah, I think that one of the things that we do to keep our message and movement impactful and safe is the work that we just do. We try to one thing that we do is every time someone posts about the Georgia runoff elections, we try to give them context on when the last day to register to vote, voting early, all those things. And I also work with you, Reggie, afterwards, because create labels for things for young people that are tweeting about Georgia runoff, so it's a lot less information. But yeah, I think that a lot of the things that that needs to happen is that we just got to continue that work. We got to continue informing people about the ways they can get informed, get engaged. But yeah, there's a lot of work to do. We got more elections coming up next year that we can continue working on, and we still got Joe Biden got elected to office, but we got to now start working on impacting bold legislation. We got to start working on how do we influence politics in a way that will be accountable to young people and make sure that we're at the table, because now we voted in massive numbers. We got to make sure that we are a part of the conversation. And that's kind of the work that we're pushing them from social media, but also being in the room as well and continuing that conversation. Yeah.
Great. Julia, how about you?
I would tell young activists to keep adults accountable, because I think the problem with activism, especially climate activism, is that adults are okay, well, the young people care, so there we go, they'll do it in 20 years. And I think it's we're 16, 15, and 18, we're going to high school, I'm doing sports after school. I shouldn't have to be worried about whether or not adults are going to burn my planet down or kill people. And I think that's part of the problem. you can't put everything on our backs. It's not our job. That doesn't mean we shouldn't care, but I think a problem is kind of being like, oh, politicians aren't doing it, we'll do it in 20 years. It's like, no, tell them to do it. Don't put it all on ourselves. Because I think it's kind of disheartening that 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds have to worry about every single thing that's happening in the world instead of focusing on being 13-year-olds.
Alexandria.
Definitely. I think that there was so much that I wish that I knew when I first started using social media for activism, because when I was 13, that's when I started to do it. So I've had like this 2-year learning period. And first I would say to make sure people are who they say they are. And so make sure you know who you're working with and partnering with, because sometimes sometimes it's not fully there. And so I also think it's helpful to limit the ways people can contact you. For example, I keep my Twitter DMs open, and I have more of a larger reach on my Twitter account. And so I got a lot of inappropriate DMs, but I also have help and support with my DMs. So this wouldn't work for other activists sometimes. And I want to let really all other activists out there know that it's okay to close your DMs and not give out your email address if you feel uncomfortable. It's really all of what you're comfortable with. And so also connect with an organization who can also help connect you with reputable people and organizations to work with. So once you find support from real people online and you have that support system, then it can be so helpful.
That's great. Reggie, I don't know if you have anything you want to add?
Utilize the features that are placed by most of these services, particularly on Twitter, to keep you safe, right? And to also be able to protect the conversation that you're having. Recognize when you have a private versus a public account and what that means for you. Recognize when your location is on. All of those different things that your parents worry about are legitimate, and you should definitely make sure you're thinking about those things as you think about being active and engaging and sharing on so many important issues. And one thing I'll put a plug in for, which you don't often hear from social media folks, it's take a break sometimes from scrolling so much on social media. There's a lot going, and it's okay to take a break when you're getting worked up or you see things that aren't necessarily encouraging or healthy. Take some time away. I think that gives us opportunity in talking with each other and engaging with folks, face to face when we can, or over Zoom, or connecting with people different who have different ideas, spending time having more conversations instead of, tweeting back and forth a lot. And so I encourage people to take care of themselves, their mental health, and also, just in general, making sure that you're well rested. I tell activists that rest is also a form of activism, so that you can make sure you can get up and do this and join the fight the next day and the next day and the years that will come to make progress. And so that's all I would add.
Thanks, Reggie. Golf clap to the rest and taking a break. I think that's so important. And thank you for saying that. I don't think that gets said enough. We have one question that was sort of we've somewhat touched on, but Ann Collier asks about innovations that you see around growing a movement. Like, are there things that you're seeing out in social media that you think are particularly effective for making your network bigger? And if you want to just raise your hand, I can see you all if you want to take that question.
I would say engaging with others in live content, I think I've seen work a lot better nowadays. Inviting other activists from other movements, creating a sense of intersectionality and going live and having a conversation with folks. That's a way, because you bring followers of one movement, of one place to another. That's something that we've seen happen historically in the country on so many different issues, that those behind different causes get together to raise the tide in general, and to have a larger movement here. And so I think having intersectionality, but beyond but making sure that it's live content that people can engage in is a way of doing so. And we're seeing a lot more of that nowadays that everyone's home, right? We're doing it right now through this conference, but not being afraid to go live and share content and have an honest dialogue with both of your movements and your followers and encourage people to follow each other. We're starting to see a lot more of that. And I think that could be one tip for everyone.
Yeah, I'd like to add on. I think that, sorry.
No, go ahead, Jerome, and then
Okay.
Julia.
Yeah, I think that some of the tools that we've seen help grow our movement has definitely been the use of like having a central hashtag for an event. That's one of the biggest things that we do is if you stick to a hashtag that you use constantly and just continue to post based on that helps like grow the movement. Like Climate Strike Friday was like one of the biggest hashtags we used, and that like became like a big impact because people kept just seeing that on their feed, that same content, and just engaging people. Other ways that I see it just like connecting with like locally. I think the one thing that it helps sustain a movement is that you may connect first digitally, but then organize physically as well. Like if it, obviously not in this pandemic time, but in normal times, it's like it helps to grow the relationship and grow the movement. If right after you have like a big digital engagement, go and support that with the physical action, like maybe having a community meeting about what just happened digitally, or just talking about different things that connect people together in the real world, because that helps to build relationships that are stronger and last longer.
Yeah, I think adding on to Jerome, hashtags can be really important. There's a huge use of the hashtag like abolish ICE when it comes to immigration reform, and often that's not very specific enough. That's not really telling people what to do, what we should do. And I've seen the rise in this hashtag that a Latinx activism group, Mi Gente, started, hashtag no tech for ICE. That was really telling data companies and technology companies to stop providing their information to ICE. That is just like being really inhumane. And I think using specificity in hashtags and in your movement, instead of just saying like abolish blank, being like, no, wait, tell specific institutions to stop supporting blank, and making it easier to understand and to educate yourself rather than just kind of, or like with climate, instead of just being like, stop climate change, it's like, okay, how? Like, what can we do? Being more specific and more niche, I think.
I of course echo the use of hashtags. I think that they're so important to create and use. Also on social media, like Reggie said, not only is content the most important aspect of building a movement, but we rely on retweets and reposts a lot, because that's how we expand our reach. And that is what amplification really is. And so I want to encourage people to repost the activism of causes they support. Reposting is how we get things to go viral, and harnessing virality is really important in our movement. And that's just one way that we can get out of this small echo chamber that sometimes we see ourselves get into.
Great. So we have a question. That's great. We have about 5 minutes left. So I guess this will probably be our last or our second to last question. From Sonia Livingston, she asks, I think directed to our activists, do you worry, whether for yourselves or others, I guess this is for everybody, that social media activism creates a record that institutions like law enforcement could use or misuse against you? And should platforms guarantee anonymous participation by activists? Just raise your hand if you want to, and I'll call on you. Julia.
I don't know if I can really specifically answer this for law enforcement, but I remember being told, like, wait, before you put your name on this, what will colleges think about this? Like, do you think that will affect? I know that's not as severe, but I think I worry for others, but I think the main advice I would say is to not put your name on anything that you don't wholeheartedly agree with, that you don't think would be something safe, that's not something dangerous or radical. Because if you are very cautious and careful about what you're attaching yourself to, I don't think that you'll have any law enforcement problems. But I think a problem is if you aren't accountable for your name and your thoughts, and you just kind of spread that into dangerous places. I think that's the main worry.
Yeah, I'm kind of more on the opposite side of this. When it comes to that, I think that really, I think if people are less anonymous, it allows for more constructive conversations. And the more you anonymize it, it gives them the opportunity and the leeway they see to just not just spam people with things that are not productive at all. And I think that if you find more ways to make sure people know that they are a part of this community, that they are active participants in it, then it allows for what their original intent of social media was, is to connect people and have a public discourse that is like positive and similar to what we see when we're talking to our friends. And I think that the more you know that you're part of this community, then the less you are to post things that are not out of the realm, that would maybe look bad to people that are in law enforcement or in that other spheres, because you know that what you do is a part of who you are and is attached to the person that you are.
Kind of going off of that, I've actually had this happen to me where organizations I partner with or speaking engagements I'm planning to do will actually vet my social media, and so go through everything I've posted. And I've really realized from that my work will follow me my whole life because of social media. So I've had to make sure that I represent myself authentically on social media, and I use it positively and to call out the truth.
And I'll point out that, of course, our policies, our Twitter policies prohibit surveillance, particularly of law enforcement and any developer or service that third-party developer or service that might use our service, right? And so we continuously work with law enforcement to inform them of this, and then also working with activists to make sure that they're aware of their rights as well. And I think the question around having anonymous participation is a very good question, one we get often. And we hear feedback from activists on both sides who would like to be able to, have an account that they use publicly, and then also have an account that they use to monitor things that are happening or to engage with others. And so I think we continue to have those conversations, but keeping health as a priority and safety and privacy as a priority as well. That I'm encouraged that we'll get to the right place on this, but I definitely welcome that conversation. I think it's one that we should continue to have amongst not only the services, the platforms, but activists.
Great. Thank you all so much. We're now at time, so many more questions that we could talk about and more discussion we can have. But thank you again. I would have everybody give a virtual round of applause to our terrific panel of Activism platform leaders, and thanks again for an audience and bringing in some great questions. And thanks, and off you go to I guess the next portion of FOSI. Thanks. Take care.